we'll do is I tip every time that I've been there, the first time I went, I strictly flew through dry flies, and that's it. And I caught plenty of fish. The second time I went, I decided that I needed to throw a dry dropper, and I caught twice as many fish. So dry dropper for me is the best way to go. But when you're fishing with guides, like at River Haven, nobody, I won't say nobody else. The guy that I was fishing with caught a couple of fish on dry flies, but I was the only one that consistently caught fish on dries. A lot of times the guides will see they'll spot a fish and they will sight nymph to it. So they'll use a yarn indicator, and 3 to 4 feet below the indicator, they'll have the beaded fly, and they'll cast and they'll fish. They'll cast up to the fish that they've found, and the hardest part for it to do that is keeping your eye on the indicator and not the fish. I struggled with that a lot. A couple times the guide wanted me to sight nymph to a fish, and I missed quite a few because I'm so used to watching the fish and not watching the indicator. But yes, to answer your question, John, sight fishing with dry flies, sight fishing with a dry dropper, and sight nymphing with a yarn indicator is typically the way that guys fish. And Ashley is asking about streamers. Sometimes they'll fish streamers, but typically not. There's not a lot of blind casting, and I'll get to that in a little bit. But when you go to a river in New Zealand, it's all sight fishing. It's like you're hunting for fish. You're not going to show up like you do at Deckers and get rigged up and walk down to the water and come to the first hole and just start beating the water. If you're blind casting, you're spooking fish. And if you're spooking fish, you're never going to see them, which means you're never going to catch one. So it really pays to get off to the side and not get in the water at all. And you're doing a lot of walking, a lot. My biggest day was 23 Ks, which is about 15 miles, just covering that much water in one day. So if you see one fish, you're typically not going to see another one for at least another couple hundred yards. So in the backcountry, the best ways to get there are heli fishing, water taxi, and tramping, which is the Kiwis word for hiking. To fish in the backcountry, there's a special permit that you need, and it's something that you can get with your license. It's free. It doesn't cost any extra money. The New Zealand DOC just wants to keep track of the number of people that are going back into the backcountry. It's the best way to get off the beaten path because you're not fishing right next to the road. And because of that, there is noticeably less angling pressure, which is going to make your experience a lot better, because typically a lot of tourists are just going to stop on the side of the road at the angling access points and fish there. And so if you're willing to hike just a little ways, just like if you were going to go to Rocky Mountain National Park or anywhere else in the backcountry here, if you're willing to walk, a mile, 2 miles, 3 miles, you're going to get to some really awesome water. Now, with heli fishing, it goes back to the same thing with the lodges. You can do it yourself. Same thing with the water taxi. You can do it yourself, but you're going to pay for it. It's quite expensive, but the experience is most definitely worth it. And here's a picture of inside the cockpit of the heli and our water taxi. And getting off the beaten path leads you to places like this. And Doug and Jeff are getting ready they're changing flies from a fish that is going to come up here in just a second. There's a better picture of Doug changing. This is one thing about the Kiwi guides is once they see a fish, they will sit on it until you catch it. So you might go through 10 or 15 fly changes. And typically it's a one cast. And if it's a refusal, you'll change flies immediately. And when you're fishing with a guide like Jeff and I were on this hosted trip, you're going to switch every fish. So Jeff got the chance at this 10-pound fish that you're going to see here in a second. And my fish was the next one after this. So I hope y'all, can you see the fish?
Yeah.
My mouse, but here he is right here. This is a 10-pound mouse eating brown. Unfortunately, Jeff did not even get a chance to hook him. And I'm shooting this from about 40 feet above the water. But they're extremely difficult to see. What you can notice here is you can see the bank on the right-hand side of the screen. This fish is only 5 feet off of the bank. They have no aerial predators there, but they're very wary about their surroundings. So you'll see a brown trout just sitting on a sandbar 3 feet off the bank in 8 inches of water, just kind of hanging out. No fishing for the eels. There are the long-finned river eels in quite a lot of places in New Zealand, just about everywhere. And in this particular lake off of this dock that we were at, you're not allowed to fish for them. And here, this picture here is of one of the huts. They range in accommodation from being really nice like that. I think that one has like 7 or 8 beds inside of it. You can book all these huts through the Department of Conservation, but they range also to as small as 1 bed and no amenities, depending on where you're at. But it's almost like the backcountry huts here that we have in the mountains, but the hut system in New Zealand is quite extensive. And the regions. So there are 6 angling regions in New Zealand. The Nelson Marlborough region, the West Coast, Southland, and Fiordland. They're considered one area down there. There's North Canterbury, Otago, and the Central South Island. And I'm going to go through just a couple of the ones that I've spent the most amount of time in. And that's the Nelson Marlborough region, the West Coast, and Southland, and a little bit of the Otago region. So Southland, this is kind of where Fiordland is. The main hub in that area is Te Anau. And this is a picture of Milford Sound, and that big mountain there is Mitre Peak. If you get the chance and you are in this area, I highly recommend doing a Milford Sound cruise. It's a great, especially if you're there with your spouse or significant other, or if you're just down there by yourself, or even with some friends. It is truly one of the great wonders of the world. But it rains a lot. So plan a few days in this region if you're going to go down there. This was coming down at the top of the mountains, heading down towards Milford Sound. And it rained. The first time that I was there, we planned 3 days in this area just so we could try to make it to Milford Sound to see it looking like this. But this picture and this picture were shot on the same day. Luckily, the cruise that I went on, we scheduled it at the perfect time and got Milford Sound with all of the waterfalls because it had been raining, and we got it with sun. So it was definitely worth it. This river is one of the few rivers that I'll name in this presentation. This is the Eglinton River, and it flows north to south, and you pretty much follow it the entire way from Te Anau up to the pass that leads you to Milford Sound. Fantastic river. This is another section of it, but just that emerald green water is beautiful. This is inside of Fiordland National Park. And this is the first fish I ever caught in New Zealand. Beautiful rainbow. Weighed about 6 pounds, but the thing that impresses me the most about this fish are its massive pec fins. Those pectorals were huge. And it ate a hippie stomper, a black one. There's not really much anything else to talk about that I have fished in Southland. I didn't spend that much time there and only fished for a day and a half. But I wanted to include it because it's such a beautiful place, and I highly recommend that you make the trip down there to see it. The Otago region is next on our list, and I shot this image just outside of Cedar Lodge. This is Queenstown on Lake Wakatipu. It's one of the cruises that they have. These are the Remarkable Mountains, which I'm sure if you've seen Lord of the Rings, you have definitely seen these in the movies. They did a lot of filming up there. And one of the rivers, this is a hydro river actually. So there's a lot of water coming down, and they actually do. Let's see. Just noticed that there are a couple questions there. John, any native fish? They were introduced just like South America. They were actually brought from Europe to Tasmania, and then Tasmania, the browns anyway, where all the browns from New Zealand are from Tasmania, which the Tasmanian fish are from Europe as well. The same with the rainbow. The rainbows were brought over from here, but in the 1800s is when they were brought over. If you ever wonder where merino wool comes from, it comes from these guys. I think the last stat that I saw is there's like 10 sheep for every Kiwi in New Zealand.
Perfect.
So this is a river. I actually just stopped off the side of the road to shoot this. And I zoomed in. I'm about 150 feet above this river looking down, but that's just to show you the clarity of how how clear the water is there. It's just absolutely stunning. This is at a farm stay that I stayed at, and this is all fog just from the river. I just walk across that paddock right there, right down to the water, and start fishing. And this is what it looks like on the river. This is a fairly big river, and they actually do jet boat tours up it, but it doesn't seem to spook the fish at all. They're used to it, just like fish on the Colorado are like used to drift boats. And that's another river valley there coming in about halfway up the screen on the right-hand side. But you get beautiful chromed out rainbows like this. And the gateway to the backcountry. There are swinging bridges everywhere in New Zealand. Some of them not as nice as this one, but this is a great great view of what the swing bridges look like going over some of the rivers there. Now we'll move on up a little bit to the West Coast. This picture here is a very famous spring creek in New Zealand called the LaFontaine Spring Creek, just like the same name as Gary LaFontaine. Very technical fishing and very spooky fish. It's the only place in New Zealand that I have not caught a fish is on the LaFontaine Spring Creek. But in my defense, I only spent about 2 hours fishing it. Larry, yeah, the fish are spooky. No, it's not to do with the fishing pressure. They are just extremely wary. And part of it is to do with the clarity of the water. Yeah. But on the West Coast here, as you're going to see, a lot of these rivers are tannin colored. So this one, it's not very wide. It's only about 10 feet wide, but it is brown. Brown. This is a fish from the Arnold River. Not much access on it, but you can actually blind fish on this river. There are so many fish in here. They're all about 14 to 16 inches. There's quite a few that are bigger, but you can actually blind fish on this river just like you would here. It's one of the only places in New Zealand that you could do that actually. But still on the West Coast, you get massive, vast expanses like this one. This is actually called the Host River. And this is just near what they call the Gates of Host. In some places, this river valley is, the channel is actually almost 2 miles wide. And it enters the ocean not very far from here. And Hokitika is one of the towns. It's kind of between Hokitika and Greymouth. Those are the two kind of hubs for the West Coast. Really cool, neat little places. And then you find stuff like this, just right on the side of the road, just a nice little wood carving gallery. Maori culture. The Ahura Hotel, not far outside of Reefton. Some old British cars. I thought they were really cool, just driving down the road and seeing these old abandoned cars and their colors. And then you make your way over towards Reefton, and Reefton is another little hub. It's an angling hub. There are a couple fly shops in that town. Still very small. It's only about the size of Fairplay, maybe even smaller. And the Broadway Tea Rooms and Bakery is a must stop, especially just to get a long black and a piece of vanilla cream cake. Long black is just like an Americano. Instead of doing the coffee first and then the water, they do the water and then the coffee, or the other way around. I can't remember, but it's basically an Americano, a Kiwi version of one. Let me go back to Reefton here. There's a lot of good fishing around Reefton, but a lot of the stuff around Reefton gets hammered because there are a lot of anglers go to Reefton. So if you're going to fish around the Reefton area, go early in the season. Otherwise, you're going to walk to fish, and you're going to see them, and they're not going to eat no matter what you do. And they've just been pressured and pressured and beat up and pressured. So the Nelson Marlborough regions, the last region that we'll visit in this presentation, but is probably the one that I've spent the most time in now, only because I did a hosted trip there and spent a week fishing it. This is a typical drive from the lodge to the river. Just because of how rainy and humid it is, there's always inversions every day, all over the place. And typically what the rivers look like in February. You can see here that it's actually smaller than Clear Creek, but it holds massive fish. That one's not so massive. That's actually one of the smallest fish that we caught on the trip. But I really just liked the colors of this fish. And again, here, I mean, this river is about the size of the Big Thompson in Moraine Park, but it holds 10-pound fish. And for me, that's why I go to New Zealand. Yeah, I can catch trout here, but I'm not going to catch as big a fish as I am in a beautiful scenery like that. So this is Doug. If you can remember back to earlier in the presentation where I was taking the picture of the guys changing flies and where I shot the video of that fish, this is where we're at. So Doug had crossed the river and is walking up that side and is trying to spot fish in that big hole. We didn't see any fish in the hole, but when he walked and made his way further up the hill, there is when he spotted that big brown. But this just shows the scale of how big the cliff was and where the water is compared to that. And Doug's a big guy. He's about 6'4". That was one of my better fish from the trip. That fish weighed about 7 pounds, I think. Dry fly eater on a cicada. And one of my all-time favorite images from my trip. I actually have this blown up big 24 by 36. Another dry fly eater. And the release. There's a perfect example of kind of the colors that I'm talking about wearing, and the shorts with the tights, just drab colors. So you don't stand out from the background, really. And if you can see the angler way down here in the left-hand corner, that's Jeff, working his way up. But just the scale of the cliffs and the size of the river was a really cool shot that I liked. And this is actually in the backcountry. So this was our heli day here. Jeff is intently listening to Doug as Doug explains to him why we are fishing the way we're fishing for this in this area. But you can see how tannin stained the water is here. I think we actually saw 3 eels this day as well. The eels are not shy. They will come up and say hello and might give you a little love tap as well. But that's a average size fish. Just again, they're beautiful. They're massive pec fins and flawless fish. That was my biggest fish of the trip, a nice 8-pounder. And celebrating the nice 10-pounder. And I bet if you look close enough, you can tell which guy caught the 10-pounder, because I think he had a couple glasses of champagne. But just a great time to be in New Zealand and spend with the guys at the lodge. The 2 in the middle, the guy who's looking away, that's Scotty, and his wife Leia, and they own River Haven. Fantastic couple. Love them to death, and I'm really glad that I've connected with them. They're fantastic. Their lodge is top notch as well. So I'm going to play a little clip from a video right here that I shot just to kind of show you what can happen. Pay attention right between the line and the rod right in here. Oh, there's the eat. Doug had walked upstream and spotted that fish and sitting right in front of the rock. And I had about 5 casts to it before I finally got the drift right. I tried to come over and land it on the right side, and Doug told me that he didn't think we were going to land it so quick. And if I could pull it to the right, that would be awesome. If not, I would be going for a ride. And he was definitely right on the money. But that was about a 30-foot cast, maybe. And I didn't want him to go too far downstream with my line. It would have been hard to control him. So that's why I had to take off running after him. Because as you'll see here, it was definitely worth it. So there's my contact info. You can follow me on Instagram at Sovereign Piscator. Same thing on Facebook. You can email me, sovereignpiscator@gmail.com, and my website. But that's all I've got for you. Does anybody have any questions?
Randy, I know you did these trips with the shop in Boulder. Have you thought about doing some independent trips, like taking a few folks?
I have actually, with all the trips that I've done, I've thought about doing that myself. But I've got a good rapport. I actually set up the entire trip with River Haven, for Front Range when I was there. I reached out to them and met with them. I actually met with them on my second trip when I was down in New Zealand, and it turned into hosting several trips there. So with Scotty and Leah, I've got a great rapport with them. So yeah, it would be something that I'd be interested in doing for sure.
So what do you think a week would cost, Randy? Roughly.
Oh, about $5,000.
Not including the flight though, right?
Not including the flight.
Which is like $2,000.
It really depends on how you go to get there. Though usually I haven't spent more than $1,000 on a flight to New Zealand from Los Angeles.
So Randy, what do you think the minimum time you should spend there? In terms of,
How much time you got?
yeah, I understand that, but I've heard from people who said, they spent a week and just got washed out. And I'm just curious what you think.
On all of my trips, I've at least spent 10 days. One trip I spent 3 weeks. And I highly recommend going for at least 2. Because if you can only go for 1, you should really try to stay at a lodge if you go for 1 week, because you're going to get the best bang for your buck, and you're not going to have to worry about, I mean, it's a long, New Zealand is long, and the roads are very windy in some places, and you will spend hours driving. It'll take to get from Queenstown to Nelson, it's like 14-hour drive. So, I mean, if you didn't want to get washed out, you'd have to drive all that, and then you have a day wasted, and then a day to recover just from the drive. And then you got to think, oh, well, I flew into Nelson, so now I've got to drive all the way back up there just to get out washed out. And then half of your trip is gone just from driving. So if you can spend 2 weeks at least, then that is the minimum amount of time that I would go if I was going to do it myself. You could do a week, like I said, but stay at a lodge. And if you've got a month, go for a month.
I went for a
Thank
month
you.
and I bought a car. Yeah, I would recommend going and buying a car. I mean, they're shitty little cars, but you only need it for a month.
You only need it for a month, exactly.
Only need it for a month.
Easy to sell?
Yeah, because
so-
yeah, the next person comes along that wants to do the same thing. You just sell it to another angler. Yeah, it was worth it. And probably, I probably only got to fish about half the time because of rain and various other things. But I went to actually go snowboarding and fly fish. So
where did you stay?
when I went, I was on the South Island most of the time. And, that actually reminds me of a question for Randy. When I went, you could pretty much camp anywhere, but Randy made the comment that when you're in an RV, you can stop anywhere because you're self-contained, but when you're camping or backpacking or whatever, you can't. And I had heard that in the last handful of years, New Zealand had such a problem with people leaving toilet paper and crap, literally, all over the place in their parks and whatnot.